Hi, welcome to Scratching the Surface. I'm Jarrett Fuller, and this is my podcast about design criticism and practice. So, as many of you know, this podcast began as part of my thesis project for my MFA at the Maryland Institute College of Art, where I was studying graphic design and critical theory. And many of you have asked if the podcast would continue after I graduated. And I wanted to let everyone know that I finished my MFA last month and that, yes, this podcast will continue. And to sort of celebrate graduation and this sort of transition from being a thesis project to just a podcast, I wanted to interview some of the professors who influenced this project and advised my thesis over the last couple years and really helped shape how I've come to think about a lot of the things that I talk about on this podcast. So for the month of June, for the next 4 weeks, I'm going to be doing a kind of special educator series where I talk to my own professors about design criticism. And first up today is Kristian Bjørnard, who is one of the design faculty at MICA and taught a class on interactive design that I took last year. Kristian and I bonded very quickly over a shared love of design theory and have spent many, many hours talking about criticism and theory and education and style. And so we finally put a microphone between us to record one of those conversations. So in this episode, I talked to Kristian about his background and how he got into design, teaching design theory, and how to approach design as a verb in the classroom, as well as his deep interest in sustainable design and what that means both in practice and how we critique it. Kristian has been a big supporter of Scratching the Surface and my larger thesis projects, and I've enjoyed getting to know him and learning from him over the last few years, and our many, many conversations have had a profound influence on the way that I think about design and approach this podcast. So I'm so happy that I get to share one of these conversations with you. So here is a fun and interesting conversation with one of my favorite professors at MICA, Kristian Bjørnard. You're basically the first person I'm talking to where we actually have like a relationship outside of just interviewing. But I don't actually know anything about kind of your life pre-MICA.
Yeah.
And so I wanted to kind of start there with how did you even get into graphic design and where did those interests come from?
I ended up becoming a graphic designer just because other things added together to end up to become that, right? So I always did a lot of painting and drawing and things like that in high school and then through college. But by the time I got to the end of high school, the way everything was set up was sort of you had to pick to start doing like college prep things or keep doing like art and music things. And I picked to like stay being in choir because I really liked being in choir at the time. And so then that like took up the classes that I could have had to take more painting or printmaking or things like that. So I was in all these sort of like advanced physics and chemistry and math and then choir. And then so when I went to college, I was like, oh, well, I have like advanced, I can like get into physics or whatever. And so I started doing math and physics as my degree plan, and then just was like really depressed in college all the time. And it was junior year of college, and this math professor that I had like asked me to stay after class one day, and he was like, "What the hell is wrong with you?" And I said, "What are you talking about?" He was like, "If you're in differential equations, normally if you're this far in math,
right,
like, you look like you want to do math, and you don't really seem like you want to be doing any of this stuff." And I said, I don't know what you mean. And he was like, you're obviously not smart, but you like don't do any of the homework. You don't do this stuff. You like miss half of the classes.
Right.
And why are you even taking math? You know? And I said, oh, well, I also really like taking like painting classes. He was like, why don't you just take painting classes then? And he was like he was also like played jazz saxophone. He like played in the college jazz band, even though he was a professor.
Yeah.
And he was like, I mean, I get it. Like I was a saxophone major. Like that was my major in college. And maybe you need to not be a math and physics major. Maybe you need to be like a painting major. So I was like, okay, cool.
What were you?
Maybe I should do that.
How did you get 3 years into it? What were you thinking? Like, what did you want to do after that?
I mean, I like building. You know, like I always like build stuff with Legos or like do technical drawings of stuff.
Yeah.
And I kind of thought like maybe that was a way into architecture or something like that. Of like, I could be an engineer, or I could be an architect, or something like that.
Okay.
And so anyway, so that's like why I was taking like quantum mechanics and electronics
I had no idea.
And electromagnetism and differential equations and like linear algebra and all that stuff. Like I took all those classes, and then so then I like was just a horribly depressed college student though, because I didn't hate it, but it was like not actually interesting beyond just like, oh cool, like that's how that works.
Right.
But it was like I don't really want to do anything with that.
Yeah.
So, like, junior year, that was the fall term, and this college I went to had, like, a trimester set up, so we had, like, a fall term, a winter term, and a spring term that were each only, like, 10 weeks long instead. So that was fall term, and then spring term, I was just, like, didn't sign up for any of the, like, physics classes I needed to sign up for, and just signed up for all, like, art classes instead. Even though there was only, like, I had to take, like, quantum mechanics and, like, one more math class and like would have had a physics major. Yeah. It was just like I'm done, and just signed up for like sculpture and painting instead. And and then my senior year was awesome. Yeah. Just made paintings and things like that. And then it sort of like I got started getting to the end. People were like, it was that same normal like bullshit thing that everybody always says, like, oh well, how are you gonna get a job if you're like a painting major? And it's like, well, I mean, who cares, really? Because, like, people get jobs with no major.
Right. So you weren't worried, you didn't care at that point?
Yeah, well, I just figured I would work something out happen. Because something always has worked out in the past. Like, you know, my, like, 23-year-old mind was like, life has not been very complicated so far. So, like, it's not going to be that much more complicated. I started looking for jobs after school, and just because of like the kind of art I particularly liked was was like in the sort of like Andy Warhol, Lichtenstein kind of like pop art genre, and so I had been doing paintings that were kind of like in that area too as a senior, but I was also really into music, and I had a bunch of friends that had bands in college, so it was like we would make our own flyers and stuff like that, and it just didn't seem like that much of a stretch to like start getting more into those things. Yeah. So I'd like make record covers for my friends and be like, oh yeah, like this is a thing I could keep trying to figure out how to do. And somebody like asked me, like one of my English major friends asked me to like, design a book cover for them or something. And so those all just became things that suddenly were like, oh, I bet I could do this for somebody else besides just my friend.
Right. When did you realize that thing you were doing was a field that was called graphic design, and that you could actually make a living doing that?
I think it was just sort of, one of the guy that taught all the photography classes at Kalamazoo, he had been like a commercial photographer before. Oh, okay. So like in his classes, he would every once in a while like tell you an anecdote about like being in the studio and having to do this thing, or like you had to take this photo for this project that went on this album, or that went into this billboard, or whatever. So like there was connection to like that there are jobs that use these things. Yeah. And I think I like had some friends that like had gotten internships at like ad agencies and stuff even. Okay. So I don't think that I like knew.
But it was a part of what...
That you could, like, take courses in graphic design?
Yeah, but it was a part of, like, just the consciousness. You knew that people did this kind of stuff. Yeah.
Okay. And like, I don't know if other kids do these things, too, but I used to always, like, draw, like, Nike posters when I was a kid, right? It was like... So I feel like
I was that,
you
but I was
kind of-
with Staples posters. I loved like the office store Staples, and I would go as like a kid, and then I would come home and try to like recreate them from memory. The posters, that were in like the windows that were advertising like I don't know new staplers or new paper clips or something.
Yeah, my
Yeah.
friends now do that with like Nike Airs.
Yeah.
Instead. We would like make our own Nike Air posters
Nice.
and hang them in our rooms.
Yeah. So did you? So how long did you work before you then decided that you wanted to go to grad school? Were you working as a designer, or how did that happen?
Yeah, so the first job I had out of college was the old job I had when I was in college, which was being a landscaper.
Okay.
So
Okay.
School got out and I like hung around Kalamazoo for a little bit and then just like went home and was living at my parents' house and worked at this like landscape company just because I didn't quite know what else to do. But I was like, wasn't just gonna take any other job. I was like, if I should try to find, if this is the thing, there's this overlap of like system-y, like mathematical engineering-y things and arty things, and like I'm gonna find something that like uses those.
Okay.
And until I can, like I'll get paid more to do this than I'll get paid to do anything else.
But you were set on finding what that connection was, or
like
what
I didn't really
you
know
knew.
that was graphic design still.
Yeah. Interesting.
But I knew that there was some way that those things could overlap.
Yeah.
And so I like applied to work at like a industrial like screen printing warehouse.
Oh wow.
Or, like facility.
Yeah.
That's
amazing.
They were like, we don't know why you're applying here, but I mean, it was also really funny to like be sending people portfolios and have them be like weird paintings I had made, and like not realizing that like maybe wasn't a thing I should be sending to these people.
Right.
Or at least not that it wasn't something I shouldn't send, but like that it probably wasn't what they were expecting.
Yeah, and you didn't know any better.
Yeah.
Right.
But I started going to like AIGA things, and I would just be like looking up stuff on like books to buy on Amazon. So like I got Bringhurst Elements of Typographic Style when just like accidentally because I found it on Amazon.
Yeah.
So anyway, so I was like looking for stuff like that. The college library, Kalamazoo College Library, had all the Looking Closers too. And I remember reading those in reading them in college, not really realizing that they were like about this thing that I was going to end up doing.
Yeah.
Which is sort of funny.
Okay, so this was a question that I was saving for later, but this actually fits in nicely here, and this is a kind of multi-part question, but it was something I was curious about with you is, one, I feel like one of the reasons that we bonded right away was kind of an interest in kind of design theory and reading about design and kind of just the general discourse around it. And so I was curious, have you always been a big reader, and where that kind of theory side came into design? And so it almost sounds like you kind of were having some of that before you even realized that it was happening, or that you were reading about a thing called graphic design, or.
Well, because I think that's just like how I've often learned things.
Okay.
Was just by deciding to read about them, or just accidentally reading about them.
Right.
And I mean, like, since I didn't really have design classes, the things that I know about design often were because I happened across a book about that, or happened to like be given a book about that by somebody, and then sort of read about it and found out about it. I mean, that's like how I found out about MICA even, was that I like accidentally got like Design It Yourself.
Oh yeah.
Just because I picked it up and didn't realize it was, I didn't realize till later that it was like from this school, like that it was part of like the actual MFA program, and it was actually like those kinds of things were like a really good way into design.
Yeah.
More because it was like I didn't really know very much about it already, so that was like a pretty good like low barrier to entry way in.
I want to finish up the Looking Closer story for a second. So like you were reading those, and those, I feel like those books for someone who maybe doesn't know anything about graphic design are not the friendliest.
No, I remember
entries into it.
Some of the essays I just would skip, right?
Yeah.
Because they were just like in the library, and I'd read them
right.
to like avoid as like procrastination from doing some other like research or homework I was in the library to do. I'd be like, I need something to look at that isn't about like Japanese history from 1800 to present day, you know.
It's so weird. Yeah.
So what can I go pick off that like art and design bookshelf instead? Because I remember also like reading print magazine because the library got like print magazine, and again like not really realizing that like some of that stuff was.
Yeah, but it was just always around. You were always kind of encountering this stuff, and you didn't realize.
Yeah, so it wasn't like intentional. It wasn't intentionally being sought out because I was like, oh, I'm a graphic designer, and these are things that graphic designers are supposed to read and look at. It was like, oh, this looks interesting, and this seems like a place where ideas that I have exist.
Yeah. Okay.
And then
I love that.
Sometimes it was just like, oh, well, that.
Yeah.
I don't understand that, so I'm just skipping it. And then now, like looking back, it's like, oh man, like some of those things that I like discounted are maybe more of the interesting things.
Right.
Now, I don't have any particular one off the top of my head I can think of, but.
So how did MICA, like how did picking up that book and realizing that MICA was a thing and that grad school was a thing that you thought you should do?
Okay, so I got done with school. I was kind of goofing around. So just to like
we skipped that part of the story.
So sort of goofing around, being like, okay, these are things I'm trying to find a way to do. I started going to all these AIGA things.
Right. Yeah, that's right.
And I met this guy, Sean Zindran, at an AIGA thing. Like he and somebody else were like helping run this like series of little workshop lectures to like introduce. Oh, this is when Creative Suite was new. So it was like introducing like some new Creative Suite features. I think.
Okay.
And I just remember like I felt really proud of myself because I had like actually bought Adobe Creative Suite 2 or whatever.
Yeah.
So like when it first came out, and so there was like a thing about using InDesign instead of Quark.
Yeah.
That I was at.
Yeah. And
he was like helping run it, and I remember like talking to him at the end because I had maybe like a band shirt on or something that he was like, oh cool, like you know about that band. And I was like, oh, those bands are so awesome. You know, it's like the way you get into a conversation with somebody. And I don't know, for some reason we like really connected, and then I just like incessantly bothered him.
Right, of course.
Afterwards. So I'd be like, oh, I'm in the city, because I was living in Northfield, Minnesota, which is about like 45 minutes south of like Minneapolis and St. Paul. So it's like still easy to get up there for stuff, but I would like go up there, like go out of my way to go up there to like an AIGA thing, or if there was like some designer talking at the Walker or something, I'd like try to go to all those things. And so like any time I was going to the city, I would be like, oh Sean, like you must not be doing anything. Maybe I can like bother you.
Yeah.
And finally, I think he got like tired of me annoying him all the time. It was like, why don't you like come by my studio, and maybe you can help me on a project or something.
Oh wow.
And so I worked on this book with him, which was this like really goofy. I mean, it wasn't that goofy. It was like probably just a regular book, but it seemed goofy at the time because it was like a color. It was like Pantone book, but it was about like picking. It was a Pantone colors for like furniture or for fabric stuff. So it was, and like clothing. Yeah. And it was about like finding colors that like reflected your season. So it was like how you figured out like what season of colors you were, and then like how you picked. And it was like like Sean and I like working on this book together, and it just seemed really funny. But I did like all these really cool illustrations for it, because that was what I was good at doing, as opposed to like the graphic designing part. Yeah. It was called More Alive with Color. That's what it was called.
All right, adding that to the Amazon page for that in the show notes.
But yeah, so that's how I sort of like, that was my first design job, I guess, just like being his kind of like assistant. And so that was like maybe like I got done with school in like 2003, so that was probably like sometime in 2004, and then by 2005, I kept working with him, like that worked out, and he like kept giving me more projects, and so I kept working with him for a while, and then sort of like 2006, I sort of like started doing more stuff on my own, and then joined up with these guys and we were all working on making biodiesel and designing websites and like publications for companies that like were trying to be more environmentally friendly.
Okay.
So we were like trying to find printers we could work with who would do like more eco-friendly printing, and we like powered, we like paid for like solar offsets for our office and stuff like that. But the main thing that the guys were doing before I started working with them was like converting people's cars to run on vegetable oil and making biodiesel.
Oh, wow.
So we did some of that too.
Yeah. This is making you make a lot more sense to me, actually, in that I feel like the way that you think about design and the work of yours that I've seen and the way you teach design definitely has a more conceptual side to it, and you don't seem as interested in, and I don't mean this to sound like you're not interested, but less interested in like the kind of commercial aspect of design, as in, my undergrad, it was all about, trying to sell things, basically. It was making posters, logos, all this stuff for other people so those people can make money. That's oversimplified, but that's basically how it is. And that's something that you don't seem to have it. Not that you don't have an interest in it, but you're much more interested in that kind of conceptual side, these kind of idea side, that making weird things. I mean weird in a good way.
Well, I mean, because what I think is most interesting about that is, well, if we just look at who we sort of say is historically important in the last 100 years for a lot of these things, they are people that weren't necessarily trying to solve things to sell stuff to people, right? Like they had some other interest, and design was just like a way to explore those things, not like an end to itself necessarily. Like, I have to design this because it's the only, like, I have to get paid to design this stuff. But I think the other part is, like, I don't, even, like, what I did in grad school, I would count nothing that I've done, really, in school as, like, being formal design education, either. Like, type 1, Oh, like, I never had to make a poster for something that didn't exist, or that was, like, an approximation of a real project, right? Like, I never had to do that.
Yeah.
So, like, I don't have that baggage, maybe.
Yeah.
And so then when I'm in class, like, I don't also have that reference to know, like, that is what should happen in, like, graphic design, too, is, like, this kind of project should be in it.
Yeah.
I'm more like, these are the things that I'm interested in making, or these are the things that I enjoy doing.
Right.
And they relate to real things you have to do in life, but they might be more interesting to you than, like, making a fake whatever.
Right. Oh, yeah, like, almost using graphic design almost more as a medium to kind of communicate your ideas than as the end result. Like, graphic design is the process instead of as, like, the thing that you're getting
like,
towards.
I am graphic designing, like, as a verb. I'm not trying to make graphic design.
I wanted to talk about how you think about teaching. And I had a couple things I wanted to ask you about for that. And one of them was how you think about taking your interests and, your kind of theoretical interest in design into the classroom. How do you bring that in to teach people who, are studying graphic design when they're, 19, 20 years old, having never worked and still trying to figure out what this thing even is? How do you think about that?
Well, I think the most important part to me is to try to not get caught up on the technical things.
Okay.
Which is really hard.
Yeah.
Because everybody's like, I want to learn this tool or this software or this technique, or I found this cool plugin, like, how do we use it?
Right.
And it's easy to get sort of like caught up in that yourself too, of like, oh man, I have to know how to use X to do Y.
Yeah.
But it's really about trying to maintain that, like, what are the important things that, like, that you need to know no matter what thing you're using them with.
Right. Like, no matter what the technology is or what software you're using or what even you're making, just what are the things you need to understand?
Yeah. And anyway, so I think I'm not there's all kinds of things that I feel like I'm not great at myself in like relationship to design or relationship to like teaching. One thing I feel like I am pretty good at is like having like the big picture and having that like idea that there is this arc and there's things that fit into this arc that regardless of like what thing you're designing, like you need to understand this.
Yeah.
And so then the trick is how do you turn all those things into what like projects are really about as opposed to just a tool. And so like maybe you teach part of a tool, but it's like in service of this other idea so that if the tool changes, you at least still like have that idea under your belt.
So it's I don't want to like oversimplify this, but you think of it as you know, theory or idea focused, and all that other kind of technical, practical things are always in service of those kind of bigger ideas.
That is my like that's my like platonic ideal for like how that should work. Obviously, like that doesn't always work out, and sometimes that like creates more problems than it solves. Sometimes that's not maybe the right way to phrase it, but sometimes it makes like things harder than they need to be. Yeah. Because like you could just anyway, like I'm teaching graphic design too now, and it's really meant. It's not really meant for this, but it is sort of seen as like the class that you learn the web things in.
Oh right, yeah.
And so sometimes your life could be easier if you just said, today we're doing this like basic thing, and like next week we're gonna add this basic thing to it, and at the end you'll have built a website, you know, like at the end of the class. And some of the students would be happier probably because they would feel like they had done like some concrete thing.
Yeah.
But I don't know if that's not really like in their best interest actually. Right. Or it's not really in the best interest of a design class, or maybe of design generally to like try to bake it down into like if you learn these technical things, you can like check off that you're a designer. Yeah. Or that you can check off that you can get a job, and maybe like tomorrow you can check off you can get a job with this like really specific concrete thing. Yeah. But it doesn't help you like 2 weeks from now, or a year from now, or 5 years from now. Right. When this thing is not the thing that people care about anymore. Right. Which is especially true in like these digital things, right? Yeah.
And so, I mean, and you can learn you can watch a Lynda tutorial, or you can find a YouTube video to teach you that stuff. Yeah. You don't need to come to a school to have another human teach that necessarily.
And then a lot of those things are also like things that are flashy. So it like looks like something, or like it does something. Yeah. But it has no substance. Yeah. And I am much more interested in like the substance of things than their surface.
Right. This is exactly what I wanted where I wanted that last question to go, actually, because we've talked a lot about, and every time we talk about it is when I always think like we need to put a microphone between us to talk about this part, is the kind of classroom critique. And this podcast is kind of at a high level about design criticism, and I've had students or younger designers kind of message me and talk about how their only kind of experience with any kind of criticism or critique is that kind of stereotypical class critique where you pin stuff up on a wall. And so I wanted to ask you about that for a couple reasons. One, I'm going to just throw all these questions at you, and you can kind of pick how you want to answer them. But what is kind of the purpose and the value of that almost like ritual now in design school? And then how do you think about it as someone who, like you just said, doesn't care about the typeface that they used and more interested in maybe the substance and kind of what they learned from it? And I ask that thinking about my own undergrad critiques that would often be a waste of time. No disrespect for those professors, but a waste of time because you'd pin stuff up on a wall, and then we would talk about how to fix the kerning between two letters, or that there was an awkward space in the part of a page layout, which doesn't seem like you can learn something from that, and I think that's very valuable. But I feel like it misses some bigger things. And then the last part of the question is what do you hope your students take away from a kind of full class critique like that, where everything's up on the wall, or that kind of critique setting? That was a lot of questions at once, but just
okay. No,
class critique.
I'll just we'll try to list them, go through them.
Okay.
Okay, so it's not that I don't care.
Yeah. I didn't mean it.
Okay. I know.
Yeah.
But I said that too. I don't care. I do care because I think that there are things that look better and things that look worse.
Right.
But I don't care to only talk about that.
Right. Yeah.
And I don't care to talk about that
that's
first.
What you meant. Yeah.
I don't care to talk about that first because you might have chosen that thing because of some important underlying part of your project,
right.
and I would like to suss that out first before I just tell you that I don't like the typeface that you chose, because I am willing to acknowledge that is more or less subjective and not really an objective thing to start a critique about.
I feel like when I kind of started getting into thinking about design criticism and what is design criticism, I almost had this disdain for critiques of form and things like colors and typefaces, and I was like, this stuff doesn't matter, we shouldn't do this, and went kind of swung almost too far into the other side, and I'm now realizing that all of those things are actually very deeply connected to that other side and carry meaning, or could be the visual representation of all of those other things.
Yeah.
And so if you're just saying, I don't like that typeface, or that drop shadow doesn't look good, but it's connected to this, thing on the theoretical side, or from some bit larger idea, that's when that critique actually gets interesting.
Yeah, I actually, this is a philosophical quandary that I have with myself sometimes, because I don't really believe in relativism.
Yeah.
But I do believe in relativism in a critique, which is that doesn't really make sense. Yeah. But because I have things that I think are better and worse, and there's definitely work that I see in classrooms. I'm like, oh my god, how did you choose this? Yeah. But I want to give them the opportunity to explain to me why they chose it first before I go. You make that expression out loud to all of them. Yeah. And sometimes sometimes there just isn't an answer, and it's just how does your taste work this way? But then you also have to think then, well, you know what? Most of these things are tastes that come from a very limited number of people originating them. Mm-hmm. And they're based on a very specific set of constraints.
Yes.
And that there probably is a lot of relativism for this. And what set of criteria am I really using to objectively judge this in the first place?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I don't mean to cut you off, but I mean, that's what I'm thinking about in my own undergrad critiques, is it was very much based on kind of Swiss modernist international style, and you have this grid and you use two typefaces, and you have this kind of harmonious layout, and I think that design is good. I still like things that look like that, but to say good, bad, yes, no,
yeah, and it's
feels like it cuts that conversation short.
Well, because it makes it really easy to have a conversation about those things, because there's you can just sort of say this doesn't follow the rules that I was also given to follow, and there's that's a normal thing, right? Is once you learn the rules, then you can break them.
Yeah.
It's but if you're only teaching them rules that somebody else invented at a different time in a different place for a different set of reasons that we don't actually the reasoning for why those rules exists has very little to do with what the milieu of life is now. So why just rote pass those down?
Yeah.
And why that be the only thing that you use as the criteria for evaluating people's work?
Yeah. Lorraine Wild, it's in A Looking Closer, so you may have read it when you were in college, has an essay that Michael Beirut turned me on to when I interviewed him, called Castles Made of Sand. And it's about modernism versus postmodernism. But she has this great paragraph in it that I love, that I just want to print out and hang above my desk. And she's like, what would you do if you were a student in college and you were taught these kind of very strict, her language was much better than the way I'm describing it, these very strict rules about what is design, this kind of modernist idea of design, and then you went out in the world and saw all this other kind of cultural vernacular and this visual language that you were told was wrong, like, what are you supposed to do with that when you're taught this very narrow thing, but then you leave the classroom and you see all of this other stuff, and that maybe those things that you're told are rules are just this kind of bizarre fraternity ritual that if you don't follow, you're out of the club.
Yeah, that's exactly how I feel,
Yeah.
actually, about that stuff, too. Anyway, so how do you then make room for that in class? And I think then the goal is to try to get people to think more about the sort of content and the context of their things versus just like, here's like raster graphics from Brockman, and we make stuff that follows these instructions.
Right.
Now, that being said, that was also partially how I learned to be a graphic designer, was like reading that book, you know?
Yeah.
And being like, oh my god, like this is like engineering and art like smashed together. Like this is so fantastic. But I also was like, but this doesn't have room in it for like this like goofy other thing that I want to do. So like how do like those things fit together? Anyway.
Yeah. Yeah.
Long story short, which I think this is not the question you asked anymore, but to actually try to like answer that is in class, then my hope is that we can talk about the things like behind what it looks like and help people figure out like if you have these interests, that like design can help you visualize those interests.
Right.
And like the right design isn't to just follow the rules of modernism. The right design is like, what is your content? Like, what is your, like, what is the culture that you're speaking to? Who, like, what's the context? What's the content?
Yeah.
And how do you visualize that? And does, like, can graphic design give you a way to visualize it that it, like, hasn't been visualized before?
Right.
You know?
Right. But I have a couple more questions just to kind of start to kind of cohere some of this stuff and wrap it up a little bit. And one of the things that I really wanted to talk to you about was sustainability and this idea of sustainable design, because that's something I know that you're very interested in and very passionate about. So what does that mean? And then kind of approaching that from the idea of a theorist or a critic.
Yeah.
How do you think about what makes design sustainable?
Yeah. There's a great Carrie Jacobs essay in the first Looking Closer called like on graphic design, style, disposability, and waste.
I remember that.
And she has this, like, she repeats it over and over again and to make her point, but she basically just says that everything you do, if you're a graphic designer, basically all that you're making is just trash. That's like slightly delayed.
Oh yeah, I remember
trash,
that. Yeah.
You know? And if you've made it like really cool, it still is trash, but like maybe it sits on a shelf for a while before it becomes trash.
Right.
You know?
Right.
So anyway, so this idea that everything you make is garbage, and that means like real physical garbage. But she has another interesting point where she says the creative process in general is a wasteful process. Like you generate a lot of creative, like conceptual waste in like narrowing down to get to your like final sort of version of something.
Right.
So that's maybe like an important thing to remember as not just a graphic designer, but a designer generally is like there's a lot of energy that gets expended in the attempt to like achieve greatness in a designed thing.
Right.
And that is like material energy, but it's also like personal and mental energy. And so there's many kinds of resources going into that aren't just like money and like time, money, and materials. That doesn't answer your question. The question was like, what does sustainability mean if you're a graphic designer? And I don't have like a super good answer to this.
Okay.
Because it is like a long, complicated philosophical answer.
Okay.
But I think that's the point. Is like sustainability isn't really like an easy thing to talk about or to solve or to even define. Because I mean, if you like define the words, if you look up sustainability in a dictionary, it's just like that a thing is sustained. Yeah. So then the important part is then like what are the things that you actually think are important that you want to sustain? And that would be like what sustainable graphic design is graphic design that is in the service of your like beliefs that you want to sustain. So I would say that if I was talking about sustainability, that I care that we like stop sort of abusing our rights as humans and like take care of each other and our planet and perhaps choose to value something other than just like how many dollars in the bank somebody has as like the indicator of somebody's success.
Right.
That there's plenty of other things we could value instead of that would be better for like all of our lives generally.
Yeah.
So I would like hope that I can make graphic design that is like in the service of those things.
That's so interesting.
So I think like being a sustainable designer then is also like acknowledging that much of the things you may be asked to make are things that aren't really valuable for humanity. So you should actively participate in not making those things.
Right.
Or not participating in the parts of culture that have to do with those things.
Yeah.
And that becomes like a really complicated set of life choices that you start having to make. But that, to me, is the most important part of sustainability. So a sustainable designer isn't somebody that has a particular process or particular methodology or specs a particular set of materials. It is a person who has like decided to believe in a certain set of things, and all their actions, both as a designer and as a human, like aid in making those, like aid in forwarding those goals.
I think that definition of sustainable design is interesting because it kind of flips the way I probably thought about it before and the way a lot of people think about it before, in that it's kind of about, recycling and, reused paper and a lot of brown and green. And you think about it in like the materials and kind of the aesthetics of what does sustainability look like. And the way you just said it is that it's more about ideas. I mean, for lack of a better word, what are the things that need to be sustained? So I have kind of two questions here. One is, how do we think about that kind of in practice? Whether we're making something for someone else or we're kind of working on a team, how do we think about sustainability as part of kind of a larger design system? And then, sorry that I'm asking two-part questions, but do you think we'll ever get to a point where almost sustainable design is almost redundant in that, we can just think of all design as everything that we make is just a type of, is sustainable?
Yeah. Okay. So I think your point about sustainable design is interesting, because if you just look up like sustainable graphic design, or if you go to the library and like, I want a sustainable design book, the ones that you find if you just type in like green graphic design or sustainable design basically focus solely on materials. It's like, how do you use less paper? How do you use less ink? How do you pick safer things? How do you do this? And
I always think of that book Cradle to Cradle, and it's like all printed on that like kind of plasticky paper.
So that first book, they're probably like the best at explaining that kind of thing, where it's like every process has to get broken down to, is it a technical thing or a natural thing, and how do we like keep those from contaminating each other, and like allow all technical things to become like more technical materials and all natural things to like go back to being natural things. And then on top of that, how can we sort of, instead of just making that inert, try to make that like environmentally advantageous, and so that like maybe my factory actually is like the air and water that come out of my factory are cleaner than the air and water that go into them. I mean, they're really, really good at doing those things, and like as consultants, they're probably like the best examples of eco stewardship and sustainability, from the point of like they are all about sustaining how life works now with just like different sets of materials and like different sets of workflows. However, they believe that everything can still be treated like the kind of capitalist system that we have. It just has different, you adopt this like waste equals food idea, and there's no, like, we're still just like buying and selling things and still just trying to make more things for people and still just like saying that like commerce is going to save humanity.
Right.
But we just will like make really, really healthy, nice things for everybody. And that is like a nice dream, and I kind of like buy into that to a certain extent. I like want nice, healthy things for everybody, but I don't completely believe that like the way we do things is that sustainable though.
Yeah.
And so like just because those things are like buildings that like a building that is a tree, and so it gets all of its energy from the sun and the soil, like that's pretty cool. But we could do that and not have to like also have like all the shitty parts of capitalism and think that we always need to like make new things and sell things to people and like Anyway. So I think that's great. Like we should probably not use materials that are like obviously bad for each other.
Yeah.
But what most of those things miss is the choice picking better materials, or is like one of the more important choices like should we be doing this at all?
Mm-hmm.
You know, and like that is like what I would think would be one of the most important questions we should like get better at asking, is like when you get asked to do a project, the first question should be like, do you really need to do this?
Yeah.
Like question mark, like I raised.
Yeah.
You know, like
right.
Really? Like there's not a better way to solve this, or like is this a problem that needs solving at all?
Yeah.
So, as a graphic designer, that's hard sometimes, because you sort of like the way that that's understood is that you are kind of you might be a partner, but you're really just like a service provider who is like helping promote or explain or whatever like the things that your clients bring to you. I think there's not a lot of current thinking that like the designer really sort of is there to like be confrontational with like the prospective client of like, well, this thing doesn't need to be made, so I'm not going to make it. And like you could say that, but then I think the argument to that would be, well, they're just gonna like ask somebody else to make it instead.
And then you're
so
out
like
that business.
I might as well do it and like try to make it the best version of that thing.
Yeah.
And I think we should just get more okay with just like not doing it. And that's probably like most projects, including most of the projects I do, are probably projects that like if I really thought hard about like the things I want to sustain.
Yeah.
Not that I don't think hard about them, but like if I like really fully said like I don't care like about how culture or society wants me to act. I'm only going to act in this way that I think is most sustainable. Most of the things that I do, I would have to not do.
Yeah.
So I'm trying to get better about that, and like being a teacher makes that a little bit easier because you like have less pressure.
Right.
I have like much less pressure on my projects.
Right.
Than I used to.
Yeah.
But that's also like not a very good example to lead. Of just like the only way to do this is if you can like also have some other job.
Yeah.
That's not sustainable either.
Right. Yeah.
So I think this is just like the biggest problem with adjectives, period, right? Is like the best way, having to describe something as being sustainable design, meaning that it is somehow different than other kinds of design.
Yeah.
Puts it at like a disadvantage.
Right.
Because it like implies that it is somehow not quite, it's either like avant-garde slightly or isn't quite regular.
Yeah, outside of the norm.
So like maybe I should be like slightly afraid of it as a client, or maybe I am going to expect that I'm going to have to like pay extra for it,
right,
or something. Sustainable design, the goal would be that everybody has intuited these feelings, and so all design should really be that way. And if you look at the sort of history of designers working and writing about these things, like like Victor Papanic's Design in the Real World, he sort of implies that if you're doing design that isn't these things, you are kind of like a design criminal. Right. And you should feel badly about your actions, and that it's not. I guess it's not like that. There is like all design is okay and some of it's just like sustainable. It's like maybe there's morally good design and morally bad design, and like some of these design things you're making, if they're not sustainable, they are like morally bad, and you shouldn't be doing them. Period. I mean, I sort of believe that to a certain extent, and like stuff like the First Thing First manifesto, like those things implies that to a certain extent. Doesn't necessarily like stop anybody from doing those things, though.
Right. My next question for you. That is exactly what I feel like you were starting to get into. Is I'm thinking about this kind of through the lens of the design critic, or through, the people who are writing about design today. Is how do you talk about sustainable design, or what does sustainable design criticism look like? Like, do you have to get into this is morally good, this is morally bad?
Well, I mean, but like criticism to a certain extent kind of does that anyway, right? Like, I mean, we often will be judging something on like some set of criteria, but like, right, like a building,
right,
that like creates like accidental segregation because of like the way that the building was designed, or the way that like a sculpture in a courtyard was designed, is like talked about in that way, that like it's doing something bad for the people that are
using
I see what
this
you
space,
mean. Right? So I think that's like I think that was like the charge that perhaps like Papanik was trying to give people, is like, if you are making this thing
I see what you're saying,
that is causing harm to your fellow human,
right,
you are like making a bad action as a designer, and it's reprehensible to a certain extent. I can't remember the author, but the title of the book is called like The True Beauty of Sustainable Design Products, or something like that. And the point in that is like, if there is hidden ugliness, like that there are like materials that went into making this are polluting, or it requires child labor to make the thing, that no matter like how superficially beautiful the thing is, it like is still an ugly product.
Right.
And so like the only things that can actually be beautiful are things that like account for all of those things, and are like socially responsible and aesthetically pleasing, and and like environmentally have some stewardship, and like still are economically viable. Like, it needs all of those things to be a beautiful product, like not just that it is formally beautiful. So it also requires, again, like I said before, that you value something, that your value structure has to be different than just like, do I get paid a lot of money for this or not? Or like, do I save money on taxes or not? Or do I save money on regulation or not? Like, if everything is just an argument about money, there's like almost no argument you're going to win, because like the economics, you could also always say short term that I save money. And it doesn't matter that like long term, like an entire country has unusable forests and water and pasture,
I mean, I guess, and that then brings it full circle to your original definition of what is sustainable design. It's the, designing around the things that you want sustained, and it's thinking about, the consequences of the things you're making now, the things that all of us are making now. What are the consequences of that thing 50 years from now, or 100 years from now, or 10 years from now?
Or like next week. Like nobody even asks like that question, right? Like nobody's even really asking like, tomorrow, what is the consequence of having made this action? And so like that's the main point of like the Carrie Jacobs, like everything you do is garbage statement, is like, you haven't really considered that tomorrow this thing is getting thrown away, but you're still making like 20,000 copies of them, or like 100 million copies of them, and like, no one's saving it, period. Like, no one is saving it, period. It's like just to announce this one thing, or it's like just the news for that day. And that's all just stuff that like is immediately trash. And while I would say that like, yes, it's probably worth printing a newspaper, because, like, we should know things. It's worth printing books, because we should know things. And I think Carrie Jacobs also makes a a side note that like besides books and records, everything is gonna be garbage.
Yeah.
Where it's like she's like acknowledges that some things do get saved. But like for the most part, like all things all designers make are trash. And instead of like embracing that and trying to do something about it, we seem to have like I don't know what the opposite of internalizing. Like you just ignored it wholesale.
Yeah.
And we even make things that didn't used to be trash into like as trash objects now, right? Like the whole fact that like Walmart exists means that we decided that things that used to be permanent are okay to just be impermanent, and it's like easier to buy a toaster every other week than it is to buy like one expensive toaster that lasts forever.
Right. My last question is, I was just curious. I wanted to like just wrap all of this up with kind of, again, I'm sorry, this is another kind of two-part, but it's two parts of the same question. I'm interested in kind of who are the writers or the books that you find yourself returning to again and again that have really kind of shaped how you think about not just kind of sustainable design, but just your kind of design practice in general.
Yeah.
And then the second part, who are the people that you're reading now that you're kind of excited about that are new to you?
Yeah. Well, definitely How Buildings Learn.
Yeah.
I still like always refer to that. And not make students, but I'll always, if the student is of the right mindset, I'll be like, you should check this book out.
Yeah.
For sure. But I also like something I got turned on to from Stuart Brand's How Buildings Learn are like all these Christopher Alexander architecture books.
Oh, I see a lot of that in what you're talking about.
Notes on the Synthesis of Form.
Yeah.
Which is like the super abstract side of his set of books. That one to me is like
I need to reread that. I read that a long time ago.
Good for thinking about like how can my design solution be a synthesis of like all of the constraints that I can think of related to it, and not just be like a thing that I'm just inventing without really considering it. But that also implies that you can't be basing your choice, that like the right formalism will also arise out of like having properly considered all of the constraints, so that it doesn't imply a style necessarily. And I guess you could then tell me that the fact that I have like a vernacular system of my own for just like choosing typefaces and colors would imply that I'm not doing that. But I leave the hole open, saying like unless there is a better choice. Yeah. So like if there doesn't seem like it matters, then that's the choice. But if like something else is presented,
that's so interesting.
I would pick a different choice. Yeah. So notes on the Synthesis of Form, I think it's great.
That's a good. I read that probably like 8 years ago or so, and I haven't read it since.
I'm trying to think of just like the books that I always tell students to read.
Yeah.
And a newer one, which I have really found helpful to me, is Speculative Everything.
Oh yeah.
But like Design for the Real World.
Yeah.
By Victor Vipanic, I think that's a good one. I really like the Magnus Nielsen's Fabian book, like his first.
Oh yeah,
book.
Yeah.
Because like I remember getting it and looking through it and being like, this isn't a cookbook. This is like a creative process book. Like he's just describing how a creative person decides how their process works.
Yeah.
And he's explaining like how he does things. Not to like let you do them yourself, but just to like present to you how you might go about doing similar things. Like, and I love that like the first page of a cookbook would be, you will not be able to make any of these recipes the way that I can make them, because I've like made my own tools, and we have like our own special thing, and like the ingredients are unique to our area. So like don't expect to be able to replicate this. It's just like so honest.
Right.
Yeah. I mean, I always return to like stuff like Bringhurst or Joseph Mueller Brockman too, just because it's like those were kind of like how I learned how to graphic design.
Yeah.
But I find that I like much less frequently recommend them to students than I used to.
Right.
Or to like other people.
Yeah.
Like I still reference them, but I don't usually tell other people to.
Yeah.
Whereas I like increasingly tell people to read Speculative Everything.
Yeah, interesting.
Or like I increasingly say like, this is going to be a crazy book, like you might not like it, but you should read Notes on the Synthesis of Form.
Yeah.
You know? I can come up with more, but
right. No, I think that was good.
I don't need to come up with more.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think that was perfect. I thought this was so fun. I'm glad that, I mean, when I started this, we have said that we have to finally record one of these because we have conversations like this all the time. And so I'm glad that we finally got to do it. So thanks.
Yeah.
Thanks for finally making time for this.
Yeah, it's my pleasure.
Cool. This episode was recorded on April 11th, 2017 in Baltimore, Maryland. Our theme music is by Andy Borgasani. We're on Twitter and Instagram at Surface Podcast. You can find us on iTunes and SoundCloud and at scratchingthesurface.fm. Thanks for listening.